Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Moonbly Moonjuice by Alan Searle. For Angie, Brad, Clara and Dennis, their journey to the moon began the day they walked into Bill's Superfoods and left with an all-expenses-paid trip to Florida. It was a rainy, dull, cold day. A day when they didn't really want to be standing in a supermarket line waiting to pay for their apples, milk and carrots. They were looking at those magazines you only seem to find in checkout lines with, headlines like "Farmer raises giant turkey," "Broccoli makes dogs brainy," "Giant turkey raises farmer." They were not really watching what was going on, and as the apples, milk and carrots reached the checkout and the first bag passed over the scanner, it happened. The bells started clanging, blue lights flashed, sirens were wailing. They nearly jumped out of their skins. They could see Mr. Bill, the supermarket owner, approaching as a voice filled the store with the words, "Congratulations! Not only have you won today's groceries for free, but you have won an all-expenses-paid trip for your family to Florida." It wasn't Mr. Bill's voice, but it was the voice of authority. People were smiling, hands were being shaken. The man from the newspaper asked their names and his friend took their photographs. It was true. They were going to Florida. Now, if anybody from Florida is reading this or listening to this, they may think it's no big deal, but it is an exciting place to go, especially if it's raining, cold and dull, where you come from. They visited all the popular places. They went on all the rides. They splashed down all the water slides. They ran, swam, walked, crawled, watched, cheered, screamed, ate, drank. They even slept a little. On the last day, they visited Cape Canaveral. Cape Canaveral is the place where they send off satellites around the Earth and rockets into outer space. Perhaps you think that instead of looking at rockets all day, you would prefer to take a few more scary rides, or perhaps shoot down a water slide or two, after a couple of hot dogs and a chocolate ice cream sundae. Angie, Brad, Claire and Dennis had thought the same way too, but they had a really good time. So good that not only did they not want to leave, they were still talking about it later that night in the hotel when everyone else had gone to sleep. It was Angie who spoke first about the idea that later became their great adventure. "Those rockets were very big. I wonder how easy it would be to fly one," she wondered. "Oh, I bet it's not too hard because the computers do it all for you, so you have time for doing experiments and things." That was Brad's comment. "It's probably like driving a car when you get used to it," said Claire, and Dennis added, "Well, we all drove the bumpers cars today. And at that carnival then, well, we did it." That's how the four of them started on the plan. To be truthful, if any of you have ever driven a bumper car, it isn't easy to begin with. But like so many other things, with a little practice, it becomes easier. When they talked about their adventure later, it seemed maybe that it was Dennis who had the beginnings of the next idea too, but it also seems they all thought it was a good idea. Whoever it was probably doesn't matter, because they all agreed if they could drive bumper cars, they could drive real cars. They couldn't get to sleep and really wanted to see the space rockets again. They knew very well that the car keys were on the table, so they thought they might as well try to drive back to Cape Canaveral and have a look around. You could wonder whether they were thinking too much, or whether they were thinking at all. They found the keys, tiptoed outside, and got in the car. It was a little bit more difficult to drive than a bumper car. One of them turned the wheel, one used the brakes, one pressed the gas pedal, and one sat in the back with eyes closed. This was one of those stunts which, if you'd seen it on television, would be accompanied by the warning, "Please do not try this at home," which sounds like good advice. It didn't take them long to arrive outside the entrance to the rocket station. The trouble was, it was closed, and there was no one around. This was probably just as well, because if they had been, the story would have ended here. They drove a little further and stopped at the side of the road. They could see the rockets on the other side of the fence, which was much too high for them to climb over. But they really wanted to do more than just look at those rockets. When they had stopped the car, it was in a poorly lit area, near a bush which was growing close to the fence. As they waited and looked longingly through the fence, a rabbit popped its head out of the bush, munched a few bites of grass at the side of the road, and popped back into the bush. A few seconds later, it appeared on the other side of the fence. The children looked at each other. If a rabbit could get through that fence, maybe they could too. They got out of the car and peered into the bush. Just at the bottom of the fence was a hole, not only big enough for a rabbit, but big enough for them to crawl through too, which of course is what they did. No one saw them as they crossed the large, flat, open area. It seemed that they would never get to the rockets, which looked to be so close, but were really over a mile away. Finally, they arrived and looked at the rockets. They were enormous. When they had visited earlier, they had not been able to get as close as they were now. The rockets were bigger than 4 school buses stuck together end to end and pointing at the sky. For all they knew, the tallest could have been longer than 50 buses stuck together. It certainly felt like that as they climbed up the ladder on the side of the rocket. The ladder went straight up and was close to the rocket. After they'd climbed past the level of one school bus, they found that one thing they did not want to do was look down. It was hard to know why they decided to climb up there, but probably after driving a car, they thought that climbing up a rocket was no big deal, and some people might agree with them. What they expected when they got to the top is even harder to figure out, but they were lucky. Someone had left the door open. They walked straight into the rocket's control room. Most of us have never been in a rocket's control room, and most of us never will see the inside of one. It was quite a big room. Certainly not the cramped space they thought it might be. The walls were painted a sort of dull white. It was very bright with fluorescent lighting. There were dials, switches, buttons, and keyboards all along one wall. If you really like to imagine what it was like, think about being in a big restroom of a fast food restaurant. Instead of the wash basins would be switches and buttons and keyboards. There was, however, one switch which was not on that wall. It was not a very big switch, which is maybe why Angie did not see it. But it was big enough. When she accidentally touched it, as she leaned back against the wall to get a better look at the room, it did its job. With a whirring noise and a clunk, the door closed behind them. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The simplest thing would, of course, been to push the switch again. Like all the switches, it was labelled, and they could all read. And no doubt this is what they would have done if only Brad had not tripped and touched a big red button as they all rushed to the door. There was a loud beep. The label next to the button said, "Take off." Everyone was quiet. They began to hear a noise. It was quiet at first, like a sort of rumble in your stomach, but it began to get louder and the rocket started to vibrate. As it got louder and louder, very slowly to begin with, but then more quickly, the rocket started to move. Faster and faster the rocket went, so that even if they had wanted to find another switch or button to try to stop it, they found they couldn't move as they were pushed back onto the floor of the rocket. How long this went on, none of them was quite sure, but it seemed like a very long time before the noise of the engine grew less, and they found that they could at first move their arms and then their bodies again. Then a very strange thing happened. Not only could they move around, they could float. They were weightless. They floated around, they bounced off the walls, they bounced off the ceiling and the floor, bumping to each other and pretending they were all sorts of Superman and Superwoman and all sorts of cartoon heroes and heroines and great people. They were having a great time and would have carried on playing like this for hours if Clara had not looked out of the window and said, "What's that big white thing?" They bounced or floated over to her and looked out of the window too. "I think it's the moon," said Dennis. "It's getting really close," said Angie. "We better do something about it," said Brad. So they did. They started looking at all the buttons and levers and dials and shouting them out. "Capsule eject, first stage separate, pizza, oil pressure, laundry, hot dogs." The moon was getting closer and closer. "Mars landing, salad dressing, ground control." Would they find it in time? "Moon landing, M&Ms." "What was that one again?" said Clara. "M&Ms," said Brad. "No, the one before," said Clara. "Moon landing," said Dennis. "Well, push it," shouted back the others. Dennis pushed the green-coloured button, and not a moment too soon. The rocket changed direction, slowed, and very quietly and gently with hardly a bump, landed on the surface of the moon. The motor slowed and stopped. Everything was very quiet for a few seconds until they realized they'd landed safely on the moon. Never having been to the moon before, they all decided they should go outside and have a look around. Dennis had been looking at all the other buttons, and before anyone could stop him, pressed the one which said, "Open door." With a swish and a clunk, the door opened. They all held their breath, since they'd been told there was no air to breathe on the moon. But you can only hold your breath for so long that eventually you have to let it out and breathe again. And when they could hold their breath no longer and they thought they would burst, they all took big breaths and to their surprise found they could breathe after all. Just like someone who had just read aloud that last sentence without taking a breath. This, of course, was good news to them. But as they looked out the door of the rocket, they noticed there was one problem that they don't have to bother with when they were climbing into the rocket. They looked down onto the surface of the moon and realized that the ladder which they climbed up to get into the rocket had been left behind. It seemed like a long way to go back to fetch the ladder, but it seemed like a long way down to the surface of the moon too. They may have stayed there thinking about this a lot longer, but Brad, leaning out, wanting to get a better view of the moon, slipped, tried to grab the door handle, missed, fell out of the rocket and hurtled towards the surface of the moon. Now, when you say hurtle, you think something is going very fast. And Brad was really hurtling in moon terms, but in earth terms, he just floated down very gently and landed without hurting himself on the surface of the moon. The moon doesn't have as much gravity as the Earth, so it only weighs about 1/6 of what you do on Earth. You don't fall as fast either. When the others saw what had happened to Brad, they jumped out too and landed next to him. It was fun weighing only 1/6 of what you weigh on Earth. They appeared to be very strong, and she picked up Claire with one arm and Dennis with the other. They found they could make big, long jumps. They could jump up and turn heads over heels in the air. They could jump and twist. They could do standing black flips. They were having a terrific time. So good, in fact, that it took a long time before anyone noticed the Moonbly watching them. Well, they didn't know it was a Moonbly at the time, but one by one, they noticed the Moonbly. They stopped jumping around, until even Dennis wondered why it was getting quieter, and stopped and stared. The Moonbly stared back. This is one of those times when it would have been great to have had a camera along, because it's much easier to get an idea of what a Moonbly looks like from a picture than from words. It seems that Moonblies are not very big. They're usually about 4 feet tall, have grey-coloured skin, a skin like the colour of an elephant, but smooth and shiny. Their mouths are quite small. They have huge blue eyes. Their ears, as you probably would expect, are pointed and narrow, and their faces seem very happy. They have 2 legs, which are shorter than human legs, but their long, thin arms nearly reach their feet. Their feet are quite big, which is apparently helpful to stop sinking in the dust on the moon. And they have 3 toes. They usually wear bright clothing and particularly like flower patterned shirts and shorts. One thing about Moonblies that you would not know from this description is that they are incredibly polite. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to stare. Please carry on," said the Moonbly in a high voice. Oh no, that's all right," said Clara, and then added, "I think we were staring too." "Allow me to introduce myself," said the Moonbly. "My name is Mock, and I'm a Moonbly." With this he put out his hand, and Clara, Dennis, Angie, and finally Brad all took their turn to shake his hand and introduce themselves. After the formalities were over, not one of them knew what to say for a while. Then they all started asking questions at once. "Well, what do you eat?" asked Angie. "Moon cheese," said Mock. "Where do you drink? Or what do you drink?" said Brad. "Moonbly Moonjuice," said Mock. "Where do you live?" asked Clara. "Moonbly Metropolis," said Mock. "Can you whistle?" wondered Dennis. "Only to Moonbly music," said Mock. Some of these replies seemed to not really be the answers they wanted. And so they started to ask more questions. What exactly was Moonbly Moonjuice, Moonbly cheese, Moonbly music, and where was Moonbly Metropolis? Of course, they all wanted to know at once, and so they all started questioning Mock at the same time. Mock was about to reply when they heard a noise which they later described as something between the roar of a lion and the squeak of a mouse. Whatever it was that made that noise, Mock did not want to stay around and answer its questions too. "Let's go," he said. "What is it?" they asked. "Moon monsters. Let's go." He led them quickly between two large rocks, around a smaller one, up a ledge on the face of a short cliff, and there, behind another rock, was the entrance to a low tunnel. "Follow me," said Mock. It seemed to be not a moment too soon. Not only were the lion roar, mouse squeak noise getting louder, but the whole surface of the moon seemed to be vibrating as if huge feet were stamping and jumping in anger. They could see why Mock wanted to be out of sight and followed him into the dark tunnel. At first they had to feel their way, but after only a few yards the tunnel started to become lighter and they could see easily. A short time after that it ended and opened up into a huge cave. Some of you may have been in big caves before, some very big caves, but this was enormous and huge. So huge it was as big as a city, which is really what it was. Inside that cave there were streets, houses, shops, playgrounds, parks, streetlights, and all the other things you find in cities. "This is Moonbly Metropolis," said Mock. Well, at least that answered one of their questions. Here inside the cave, even though they could still feel the vibrations of the moon monster's feet, they felt safe. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away and they followed Mock into the city. Most comics, cartoons and movies show cities in space with cars which seem to float on air, moving sidewalks, roads intertwining in the air like spaghetti, houses like huge bubbles, but not many people. And those that are there keeping out of each other's way. Moonbly Metropolis was nothing like this at all. To begin with, there were no cars or vehicles of any kind. All the Moonbleys walked everywhere, and since they were very respectful, they helped each other and stopped and talked to one another. Now, they were very courteous and only politely curious about the children from Earth who were walking through their city. Their houses were not very large, only 1 or 2 floors, and were painted with bright flowered patterns. But the most striking thing about the houses was that they had no roofs, doors, or windows. Mock explained that since there were no snowstorms, storms, or moon monsoons, they never did find out what a moon monsoon was, in the cave, they did not need roofs or windows. It was not polite to have doors anyway. The children hadn't thought about that, but after thinking that fewer doors on Earth would make life a lot easier, agreed that it was a good point too. They came to Mock's house and followed him inside. They sat down on chairs around a square table, which, like the houses, seemed to be made out of moon rock. Mock poured a thick blue liquid from a large moon rock jug into the 4 cups. He explained it was called Moonbly Moonjuice. Although they only sipped it cautiously to begin with, they quickly got to like its strawberry, vanilla, chocolate, raspberry, nutty apple flavour. It was excellent. "Oh, I should have told you," Mock said when they had nearly finished their drinks. "This drink has unusual effects on humans." "Like what?" said Clara, eyeing the blue liquid in the cup suspiciously. "Well, for one thing, it makes them bounce," said Mock. "Bounce?" Dennis wondered. "Yes, it makes humans more bounceable. They can jump higher, and when they land, it seems to spring into the air. Don't worry, the effect only lasts about 10 moon minutes." Although they all already wondered about it, they were too polite to ask how long that was in Earth time. Brad, however, was curious about moon monsters and asked Mock about them. "Oh dear," Mock replied sadly. Things haven't been the same since they appeared." He told them a story about how moon monsters had just been characters and tales they told their children. "Don't go into the mountains," they would say, "or the moon monsters will get you." No one really had thought they'd existed, and was often said to stop the Moonbly children from wandering too far away. One day, however, the ground had shaken. There was a terrible roaring, mouse squeak sound, and the Moonbleys had fled from the moon's surface to live in their underground city. Now, when they went up on the moon's surface, they were careful to avoid any monsters, because they were huge and left footprints as long as 2 Moonbleys. Brad was still curious. "Well, what do they look like?" he asked. "Oh, they must be terrible and huge. Just take a look at their footprints," said Meg. "Yes," said Brad, "but I mean, what colour are they? How many heads do they have? Are their eyes square?" "Well," replied Mock, "nobody knows. You see, whenever they are around, we make sure that we are not." "I'd like to have a look at them," said Brad. "What about it then? he asked the others. Sure, said Andrew. Great idea, said Clara. Super, added Dennis. They agreed they wanted to have a look at the moon monsters. Now, if you'd driven a car in Florida, successfully flown a rocket from the Earth to the moon, and had a conversation with a Moonbly, then perhaps you too wouldn't think twice about tackling a moon monster. On the other hand, maybe one other side effect the Moonbly Moonjuice has on humans was to make them a little bit more confident than they ought to be. A short time later, they were once again outside the entrance to Moonbly Metropolis, standing on the surface of the moon. They said their goodbyes to Mock, who really did not want them to go, especially since he was now standing on the edge of a footprint left by a moon monster. It really was a big footprint, and although they were having second thoughts about finding the monsters, the four children set off to follow the tracks in the moon dust. After a few minutes, any concerns they had were forgotten, as they realized that what Mock had said about Moonbly Moonjuice was quite true. It did make humans bounce all over the place. They bounced off rocks, sideways, topways, and underways. They bounced off cliff walls, and when there were no rocks or cliffs, they just bounced along. It was great fun. They followed the tracks into a valley where the sides grew steeper, taller and narrower, the bottom darker, and the bouncing more fun. So much fun that they failed to notice the tracks had disappeared. They had to go back to find out that the tracks led into a low, black cave which they had not noticed when they were bouncing along. They stopped bouncing, something that was not easy to do, but they found if they made no quick movements, they eventually came to a stop. The footprints led into a cave, but it was dark, and they could not see very far. They hesitated. They were not quite sure what to do next. They did not have long to wait. Suddenly a roar came out of the cave. It was a horrible, terrible, squeaky mouse lion roar. They didn't know what to do. No wonder the Moonblies kept away from the moon monsters. Came the roar again. Only this time it seemed louder and nearer now. What should they do? It was Clara who saved the day. She said. Came the noise from the cave. Went all the children. Went the cave. Said the children. Said the cave. Yelled the children. Came the noise from the cave. Please don't hurt me. Well, all right. I'll come out if you're nice to me, said the voice from the cave. Well, all right then, but you be nice too, replied Clara. They moved slowly back from the cave, in case they'd started to bounce again, but then you're not worried. The effects of the Moonbly Moonjuice had worn off. Slowly, the moon monster came out of the cave. First came its enormous feet with 2 green toes on each one, then its purple legs, and finally the rest of the monster came into sight. Well, it was called a monster, probably because it was like lots of things in life, which seem scary when you don't understand them. But the body of the monster was really like a big, green, woolly sheep. The head, if it hadn't been for the orange hair and the large, egg-shaped eyes, could have belonged to a teddy bear. It didn't look scary at all. In fact, it looked quite friendly. Can I help you? It asked. No one knew what to say. It was a few seconds before Dennis replied, well, we just came to find out what a moon monster looks like and why you're scaring the Moonblies all the time. I'm not a monster. We aren't trying to scare anyone. Well, what are you? Asked Angie. I'm a moonmite. This left the children a little confused, probably because the English language can be a bit confusing here too. A mite, spelled M-I-T-E, is a very small insect. But mite, spelled M-I-G-H-T, means strength and power. Do you have a name? Asked Brad. Mac, said the moonmite. You'd probably better let me tell you all about moonmites, he continued. It seemed that for many years, moonmites lived a quiet, happy, but boring life in the mountains. They moved rocks around and grew a few moon crops, but they didn't do much else. They didn't read, go to school, or play games. They enjoyed talking to each other when they were not working, but often there wasn't much to talk about. Eventually, some of the moonmites had decided to see if there was any way in which they could make life more interesting, not only for themselves, but for everyone else on the moon. They all set out in different groups to explore alternative lifestyles. They left not a moment too soon, because a meteor had landed on the city the next day and destroyed it. The city had been on the dark, colder side of the moon, which explained their woolly coats, and why the meteor's damage had not been seen from Earth. The children found the story quite fascinating, but also realized it didn't explain everything. "But why do you stamp the ground so hard to make all that roaring noise?" Clara asked. "Oh, we don't like to stamp, but our feet are meant to be filled, and when they're not, it's very hard not to stamp. They sort of flop around. We like roaring. It helps shake down the rocks we're working with, and we can still call to each other when it gets noisy," replied Mac. Like so many other answers they had since arriving on the moon, this one seemed to bring up even more questions, some of which Mac answered. It seemed the Moonmites' feet were big, so they could carry rocks on them. Instead of stamping, they glided along just like being on skis. He also agreed that since it was quiet in this part of the moon, the roaring was not really necessary, and that he and the others were beginning to enjoy having normal conversations. "What others?" asked Clara. "The other 5, said Mac. He opened his mouth, took a deep breath to roar into the cave, but as he noticed the children putting their hands over their ears, he said, "Oh, sorry, force of habit," and then called in a normal voice, "Come on out, everyone." Out of the cave came 5 more Moonmites. They were quiet and giggly at first, but soon started talking to the children. They were very interested in anything about life on Earth, and the children could have talked to them for ages if they hadn't realized it was getting late and they needed to get back to their rockets and the Moonblies. However, when they remembered they could no longer bounce along, they realized it was going to take them a lot longer to walk back, and the Moonmites decided to help. The children stood on the feet of Mac and his brother Mo, and they glided over the moon's surface with hardly a noise. The others did not come, because they would have made such a noise with their empty feet flopping around that they thought it would scare the Moonblies. If the Moonmites were going to help others on the moon, they may as well start with the Moonblies. It didn't take long before the children came back in sight of their rocket and went ahead into Moonbly Metropolis to find Mock and the other Moonblies. The Moonblies did not want to come out to begin with, but Dennis pointed out not meet the visitors might be considered totally impolite. And so, with the children leading, the Moonblies and the Moonmites met for the first time. To begin with, they were all very shy of one another, but soon they started talking together as if they'd been friends for life. The conversation stopped for a few seconds when Mo started roaring and stamping, but it seemed that one of the Moonblies was doubting that such interesting people as the Moonmites could have made such noises which had scared them for so long. They were quickly convinced, and soon there was talk of picnics in the mountains, concerts, hiking trips, cooking lessons, and all sorts of activities which they thought would be fun together. While this was going on, the children went to look at their rocket. There was one problem, which they all noticed as soon as they looked up at the top to the control room. They had fallen out of the rocket, but how could they back up there again? They stared at the top of the rocket, wondering what to do, but then Brad had an idea and talked to Mock. They both disappeared for a few minutes and came back holding a big bottle between them. "Let's try the Moonbly Moonjuice," said Brad. So they did. It wasn't easy. They said their goodbyes to the Moonblies and the Moonmites by climbing up the big rock on the left, bouncing off the cliff on the right, and the flat surface of the moon 3 times. They eventually got enough bounce to land on top of the rocket. All that is except Dennis, who kept just a little too low, and just when it seemed like he would miss it again, there came a roar below from Mac and Mo, which pushed him the extra few inches to make him land on the top. "Thank you," shouted Dennis. "Thank you," shouted back the Moonblies and the Moonmites. They waved goodbye, closed the door, and after a few seconds located the moon takeoff switch. They looked out to make sure everyone was clear, and Clara pushed the switch. For a few seconds, like before, nothing seemed to happen. Then, with a roar which the Moonmites would have been proud of, the rocket took off, leaving the moon behind. The journey back was quite uneventful, except for one thing, and that was the pizza. They knew how to fly the rocket now. They pushed the button marked "Return to Earth" and ignored the ones which said "Pluto Day Trip" and "Mars Vacation," but they were hungry. All they had to eat or drink was the Moonbly Moonjuice, so when Angie found the button marked "Pizza" and next to it a switch which gave the alternatives continuous or individual, Everyone agreed that continuous was the one to choose. For a while they were right. Every 5 minutes a bell rang and a large pepperoni pizza floated out of the pizza delivery chute. After they were halfway through their second pizzas, they were beginning to feel full. Of course, they still had room for a chocolate ice cream sundae or two. And so Angie decided it was time to turn off the pizza maker and concentrate on dessert. It stuck, she said, and it was. No matter how they tried, they could not turn off the pizza machine. Every 5 minutes, a pizza floated out of the chute. This may not have been a problem if the pizzas had collected in a tidy heap on the floor, but they were floating around the control room, getting in the way when they went back to get thirds and fourths of the chocolate sundaes. They solved the problem by sticking the pizzas to the ceiling and walls. They were weightless, and the cheese and sauce made excellent glue. Eventually, all the ceiling and the walls were covered with pizza, and they were sticking pizzas on top of one another to keep them out of the way. They kept a close look out the window, and when the Earth seemed close enough, Clara pulled the Earth landing lever. The rocket slowed and made a smooth landing in exactly the same place it had been before they'd started. Everything was back as it was before. Well, not quite. If you take a rocket from Cape Canaveral, even in the middle of the night, someone is going to notice. When they looked out of the window, there were soldiers, tanks, policemen, police cars, helicopters, newspaper reporters, spotlights, television cameras, and hot dog stands surrounding the rocket. They opened the door and looked out. The ladder which they had left behind was still there. They had no choice but to go down. They would be in big trouble now. The pizza machine made one last pizza, which fell on the floor with a sloppy noise. This seemed to be the signal for all the other pizzas which had been attached to the ceiling and walls to make slurping and sliding noises. No longer weightless, they fell onto the children, who were quickly covered in cheese sauce and pepperoni. They tried to get the mess off their clothing, but the more they tried, the messier they became. The only way they could escape was to get out of the control room and climb down the ladder. The lights seemed very bright as they climbed down the ladder and collected at the bottom. They were expecting to be arrested, sent to jail, or something a lot worse. But the only person who came forward to meet them was a bearded man in a white coat. "Welcome to Earth," he said as he stopped about 10 yards away from them. The children looked at each other in amazement and then realized what was happening. They didn't look like children. They were the pizza blobs from outer space. Dennis replied first. "Blinkety squeak, gobble gloop, growing, grubby, going, what's it?" he said. "I am sorry I don't speak your language," said the bearded man. "Take us to your leader," Dennis replied in his best alien from outer space type accent. "One moment, please," said the man as he left to go and talk to his colleagues. "What are we going to do?" said Angie as they all whispered together. "It's not going to take them long to find out that we are not aliens. Don't you think we wait to see if he'll take us to the president, and then when we get there beg for mercy?" asked Clara. It seemed like the best plan, little Brad said. "There's one thing we should try first." And from under his pizza-covered jacket, he produced a bottle of Moonbly Moonjuice, which would help them get back into the spaceship on the moon. They each drank a little. The bearded man was coming back. "The president has agreed to see you. We have some limousines waiting to take you to him now," he said. "Oogly flop, linking, blinker, plucker, bucket. Bye-bye," said Dennis, and jumped up and down. The others did the same. The Moonbly Moonjuice was working. They bounced higher and higher. They bounced over the soldiers, the tanks, and the policemen. They bounced over the hot dog stand. Well, that was except for Brad, who actually bounced on it. Before anyone could stop them, they bounced away into the darkness to where they had left their car. With every bounce, pizza and pepperoni fell off them, so by the time they'd bounced over the fence they were sitting in the car, they looked like children again. "Quick," said Clara. "It's not going to take them long to follow us and realize what happened." They started the car and just turned the corner out of sight when the first police car arrived on the other side of the fence. They were safe. They arrived back at the hotel and cleaned the car. They got into bed, and it seemed they'd only just closed their eyes when they were woken for breakfast. It was pizza. That day they flew back to their home and managed to sleep nearly all the way. They decided not to tell any of their friends about the adventure when they were back in school. For a while, whenever Brad played basketball, Clara tried a high jump, Dennis played goal in soccer, or Angie danced in ballet, It seemed to everyone else they almost bounced. They could get so high. That didn't last long, because they decided it was not really fair to other teams, and they should save the Moonbly Moonjuice for real emergencies. They all agreed to this. Eventually, they did need it for another adventure, but that, as they always seem to say, is another story. They looked to see if any of the newspapers had anything to say about their trip, and for a long time none of them did. But about 3 months later, they were all again in the checkout line at Bill's Superfoods, looking at those magazines, where they noticed a front page magazine with the headline of "Alien Spacemen Like Pizza." On the front page was a hazy photograph of the four of them standing at the bottom of the rocket. They bought a copy of the paper and took it home. The story claimed that aliens had borrowed a rocket from Cape Canaveral, flown into Mars, and come back with lots of pizza. Scientists were now wondering if the red colour of Mars was in fact due to pizza sauce. The front page picture was of the aliens landing at the White House, asking to speak to the president and discuss pizza farming on Mars. However, it seems the aliens had disappeared in a blue flash and had not been seen since. Of course, the authorities were denying everything. The children were relieved. Fortunately, the story was like the ones they'd seen in every edition, and no one believed any of those either. One night that summer, the children visited a space observatory, and when the rest of the school was having hot chocolate and cookies, they went back to have a look at the moon through the huge telescope. They pointed at the bottom left-hand corner of the moon, and there, very briefly, they thought they could see the small figure of a moonmite sliding along the moon's surface with moonblies on each foot. But when they blinked their eyes and looked again, there was nothing to be seen. The end.